I'm sorry, but the club has certain standards for dress code. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable watching from the public viewing area. Reginald Thornfield, Commodore of the exclusive Monterey Peninsula Yacht Club, smiled coldly as he gestured toward the chain-link fence separating the elite from the ordinary. The inappropriately dressed man he was ejecting wore clean khakis and a pressed shirt and carried 30 years of Navy SEAL underwater rescue experience that nobody at this yacht club could imagine. But in exactly 2 hours, when a champion racer's yacht would flip upside down in 40-knot winds, with crew trapped inside, that same unfit guest would steal a $1 million boat and dive into 53-degree water to save lives while the yacht club's elite stood paralyzed on shore. Before we dive into this story of judgment, courage, and a rescue that turned privilege upside down, tell us in the comments, have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked? And if you believe that character matters more than appearances, hit that subscribe button, because this story will show you what happens when real heroism meets fake authority. The club was everything Frank had expected, and nothing he felt comfortable with. Manicured lawns stretched toward gleaming white docks where million-dollar yachts bobbed like oversized toys. Men in crisp polo shirts and women in designer sailing attire moved with the easy confidence that came from never having to check a price tag. Everything about the place whispered exclusivity, from the pristine clubhouse with its soaring windows to the uniformed staff who glided silently between tables on the waterfront terrace. Frank's daughter Sarah emerged from the driver's side, her auburn hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, wearing a simple but elegant navy dress that struck exactly the right note between respectful and understated. At 42, Sarah had inherited her father's steady demeanor and quiet strength, though she'd channeled it into marine biology rather than military service. "Dad, you sure you're okay with this?" Sarah asked, linking her arm through his as they walked toward the entrance. "I know this isn't really your scene." Frank patted her hand gently. "Your husband's competing for his first major regatta win. Where else would I be?" Michael Chen, Sarah's husband of 8 years, was already down at the docks with his racing crew, making final preparations for the Pacific Coast Championship Regatta. Frank had watched Michael grow from a nervous boyfriend who couldn't quite meet his eyes to a confident maritime lawyer who'd earned Frank's quiet respect through patience, dedication, and genuine love for Sarah. If Michael wanted to spend his weekends racing expensive boats against other lawyers and tech executives, Frank could manage a few hours of polite socializing. They approached the clubhouse entrance, where a brass plaque announced members and invited guests only. Frank straightened his shoulders unconsciously, a habit from decades of military bearing, and followed Sarah through the heavy oak doors. The interior was all polished wood and nautical brass, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of the bay. Soft classical music drifted from hidden speakers, and the air carried the faint scent of expensive leather and fresh flowers. It was undeniably beautiful, but Frank felt as out of place as a submarine in a swimming pool. "Welcome to Monterey Peninsula Yacht Club," said a young woman behind the reception desk, her smile bright and professional. "May I help you?" "Sarah Chen and guest," Sarah replied. "My husband Michael is racing in today's regatta." The receptionist's smile widened as she checked her computer. "Of course, Mrs. Chen. Mr. Chen spoke with our race committee earlier. You're all set for the competitor's family area." She gestured toward the waterfront terrace. "The races begin at 11, and lunch will be served starting at noon." They made their way through the clubhouse, past displays of racing trophies and photographs of past commodores. Frank noticed how conversations seemed to pause as they passed, eyes lingering on his simple khakis and button-down shirt, clean and pressed, but clearly not from the same boutique suppliers favored by the other guests. The waterfront terrace was a symphony of white tablecloths, crystal glasses, and animated conversation. Frank counted at least 60 people, all looking like they'd stepped from the pages of a sailing magazine. He and Sarah found seats at a table near the railing, where they could watch the race preparations below. Michael's yacht, Sarah's dream, was a sleek 40-footer with clean lines and professional rigging. Frank watched with interest as Michael and his crew went through their pre-race checklist with military precision. Say what you would about yacht racing, Frank thought, but these people took their sailing seriously. Frank Morrison? Frank turned to find a tall man in his 50s approaching their table. He wore the kind of casual clothes that probably cost more than Frank's monthly pension, and his bearing suggested someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "I'm Reginald Thornfield, Club Commodore," the man said, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "I don't believe we've met." Frank stood and shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and calculating eyes. "Good to meet you, Mr. Thornfield. I'm Sarah's father." "Ah, yes, Sarah Chen, marine biologist, I believe. Fascinating work." Thornfield's smile was practiced and empty. "And you're visiting from—" "Sacramento area," Frank replied simply. "I see." Thornfield glanced around the terrace, then back at Frank. "Well, Mr. Morrison, I hope you'll understand that the club has certain standards for dress code, particularly during major events like today's regatta." Frank looked down at his clothes. Pressed khakis, clean button-down shirt, leather boat shoes that had seen better days but were perfectly functional. "Is there a problem?" "Well, we typically expect our guests to maintain a certain level of presentation, particularly when club members and their families are entertaining important sponsors and sailing dignitaries." Thornfield's voice carried the tone of someone delivering a gentle correction to a child. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable watching from the public viewing area. It's just outside the club grounds. Lovely view of the water." Sarah's face flushed. "Excuse me, but my father is a guest of a competing member. He has every right to—" Thornfield raised a hand in a gesture that managed to be both dismissive and condescending. Of course. I'm simply thinking of everyone's comfort. We have certain expectations here, and I'd hate for anyone to feel out of place." Frank felt Sarah tense beside him, but he placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Sarah, it's fine." "No, Dad, it's not fine." Sarah stood, her voice carrying across the terrace. "My father is a retired Navy veteran with 30 years of service. He's here to support his son-in-law, and he's dressed perfectly appropriately for any civilized gathering." The terrace had gone quiet, conversations pausing as heads turned toward their table. Frank could feel the weight of dozens of stares, some curious, others uncomfortable, a few openly disapproving. Thornfield's smile never wavered, but his eyes hardened. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sure your father is a fine man, but the club has standards that apply to all guests regardless of background. Perhaps this is simply a misunderstanding about our dress expectations." "What standards?" Sarah's voice rose another notch. "A clean shirt and pressed pants aren't good enough for you." "Sarah," Frank said quietly, standing and placing both hands on her shoulders. "Let it go." She turned to face him, eyes bright with anger and embarrassment. "Dad, you don't have to—" "Yes, I do." Frank's voice was calm, but Sarah recognized the tone from her childhood, the quiet authority that brooked no argument. "It's Mr. Thornfield's club, his rules." Frank looked directly at the Commodore. "I'll watch from the public area. Thank you for the clarification about your standards." The walk through the silent terrace felt endless. Frank maintained his steady pace, shoulders straight, while Sarah struggled to contain her fury. Behind them, conversations gradually resumed, but Frank could feel the lingering stares and whispered comments. As they reached the clubhouse door, Sarah stopped. "Dad, this is humiliating. Michael's going to be furious when he finds out." "Michael's going to win his race," Frank replied firmly. "That's what matters today, not some Commodore's opinion of my wardrobe." The public viewing area was a small stretch of beach and rocks about 200 yards from the yacht club, separated by a chain-link fence and a significant difference in amenities. Instead of white tablecloths and crystal, there were weathered picnic tables and a small snack stand. But the view of the racecourse was actually better, Frank noted with satisfaction. A few dozen people had gathered to watch the regatta. Families with children, serious sailing enthusiasts with binoculars and cameras, and a handful of other folks who looked like they'd been priced out of the yacht club experience. Frank felt considerably more comfortable among them. "This is actually much better," Sarah said, though her voice still carried traces of anger. "At least here we won't have to listen to Commodore What's-His-Name pontificating about yacht varnish or whatever these people talk about." They found a spot on a large driftwood log that offered an unobstructed view of the starting line. Frank pulled a small pair of binoculars from his jacket pocket, military surplus from his Navy days, and focused on Sarah's dream. Michael and his crew were making final adjustments to their sails, and Frank could see the tension and concentration on their faces even from this distance. 10 minutes to start. announced a voice over the club's loudspeaker system, the sound carrying clearly across the water. Frank studied the 15 boats jockeying for position near the starting line. Each yacht represented hundreds of thousands of dollars and countless hours of preparation. The crews moved with practiced efficiency, adjusting sails and plotting courses with the intensity of combat pilots. "You know," Frank said, watching the boats maneuver, "your mother would have gotten a kick out of this whole thing." Sarah smiled, her first genuine smile since the confrontation with Thornfield. She would have marched right back into that clubhouse and given that pompous commodore a piece of her mind. "She would have," Frank agreed. "And then she would have insisted on staying for lunch just to prove a point." They watched in comfortable silence as the starting sequence began. A horn sounded from the race committee boat, followed by the raising of warning flags. The yachts began their final approach to the starting line, each crew searching for the perfect combination of speed and position. Frank had sailed a bit during his Navy years, small boats for training and recreation, but nothing like this. These crews were artists, reading wind patterns and water conditions with an intuition born of years of experience. He found himself genuinely impressed by the skill required to handle such large, powerful boats in close quarters. "There's Michael." Sarah pointed as Sarah's Dream crossed the starting line in third position, sails full and drawing well. "He's got a good start." The fleet spread out across the bay, each boat seeking the most advantageous course toward the first mark. Frank followed their progress through his binoculars, noting how Michael's crew worked together with smooth efficiency. Whatever else you could say about yacht racing, Frank thought, it required real seamanship. The first sign of trouble came 20 minutes into the race, when Frank noticed the wind beginning to shift. What had been a steady 15-knot breeze from the northwest was backing toward the west and increasing. He glanced at the sky, noting the high clouds that had been building since morning were thickening and darkening. "Weather's changing," he said to Sarah, who was following the race through her own small binoculars. "The race committee will be watching it," she replied. "They'll call it off if conditions get dangerous." Frank wasn't so sure. He'd seen race committees in various sports push events forward despite deteriorating conditions, reluctant to disappoint competitors and spectators. And yacht racing, with its culture of courage and seamanship, seemed particularly prone to sail now, worry later decisions. By the time the fleet reached the first turning mark, the wind was gusting to 25 knots and the wave height was building. Frank watched through his binoculars as several boats struggled with the conditions, crews working frantically to reef sails and maintain control. Sarah's Dream was holding her position well, but Frank could see Michael's crew was working hard. The boat's motion through the water had changed from the smooth grace of the race start to the more violent pitching and rolling of heavy weather sailing. "They should call this off," Frank muttered, watching a smaller yacht nearly lose control as a gust caught her mainsail. "The race committee boat is signaling something," Sarah said, pointing toward the official vessel anchored near the starting area. Frank focused his binoculars on the committee boat and saw crew members raising flags. But instead of the signal to abandon the race, they were indicating a course change, shortening the race to account for conditions, but allowing it to continue. "Idiots," Frank said under his breath. The wind continued to build as the fleet approached the second mark. What had been challenging sailing conditions were rapidly becoming dangerous ones. Frank counted at least 3 boats that had retired from the race, their crews unwilling to risk equipment or safety for a trophy. But the leaders were still racing hard, including Sarah's Dream, now running second behind a larger yacht with a professional crew. Frank could see Michael at the helm, his body language tense but controlled as he fought to keep his boat at maximum speed while managing the increasing wind and waves. That's when Frank saw the squall line. It appeared as a dark wall of clouds racing across the bay from the northwest, accompanied by the distinctive white curtain of rain that marked heavy weather. Frank estimated its speed and trajectory with the automatic calculation of 30 years at sea, and his stomach clenched. "Sarah," he said urgently, "get your phone. Call the harbor patrol." "What? Why?" "That squall is going to hit the fleet in about 10 minutes, and it's going to be blowing 40 knots or more." Frank was already standing, his eyes fixed on the approaching weather. "Some of these boats aren't going to handle it." Sarah pulled out her phone, but before she could dial, the first gust front arrived. Frank watched in horror as the line of wind hit the racing fleet like an invisible tsunami. Sails that had been perfectly trimmed suddenly became overwhelmed engines of destruction. Two boats immediately broached, turned sideways to the wind and waves, their crews scrambling to regain control. Sarah's dream was fighting her own battle. Frank could see Michael struggling with the helm as his crew worked to reduce sail area, but they were caught in the middle of attack when the wind hit. The boat staggered under the sudden pressure, her rail going underwater as she heeled far over. "Oh God," Sarah whispered, her phone forgotten in her hand. For a moment, Frank thought Michael's crew would recover. The boat began to right herself, and he could see crew members moving to release the pressure on the sails. But then a second stronger gust arrived, and Sarah's dream went over. She didn't just heel or broach. She rolled completely inverted, her mast pointing straight down into the dark water of Monterey Bay. Frank could see tiny figures in the water around the overturned hull, but from this distance, it was impossible to tell if anyone was trapped underneath. The yacht club terrace erupted in activity as the reality of the situation became clear. Frank could hear shouts and the sound of chairs scraping against stone as people rushed to the waterfront railings. But even from the public viewing area, Frank could see the confusion and delay in the emergency response. The race committee boat was trying to make its way toward the overturned yacht, but the same conditions that had caused the accident were hampering the rescue effort. The committee boat was too small for the conditions, taking heavy spray over her bow as she fought through the building waves. Sarah was already on her phone with Harbor Patrol, but Frank knew how long it would take for official rescue vessels to arrive. In conditions like this, with water temperature in the 50s and crew members potentially trapped under the boat, minutes mattered more than resources. Frank scanned the harbor with his binoculars, looking for anything that might reach the scene faster. There, a large motor yacht moored near the yacht club docks, maybe 60 feet long, with the size and power to handle the conditions. But even as he watched, he could see the yacht club staff struggling to organize any kind of rescue effort. "Dad!" Sarah's voice was tight with fear. "Harbor Patrol says 15 minutes minimum." Frank was already moving toward the water. "Too long." "Dad, where are you going?" "To get a boat." Frank's voice carried the same calm authority Sarah remembered from her childhood, when her father would take charge of any crisis with quiet competence. "Call Michael's crew chief. Martinez, I think his name is. Tell him to have them ready to receive casualties." Frank broke into a steady jog toward the yacht club docks, his military training overriding the protests of 68-year-old joints. Behind him, Sarah was already dialing, her voice sharp with urgency as she tried to coordinate with Michael's shore crew. The yacht club docks were in chaos. Club members stood in small groups, pointing toward the overturned boat and discussing what should be done. Frank could hear fragments of conversation: insurance concerns, liability issues, whether the club's small launches could handle the conditions. Frank ignored them all and headed straight for the large motor yacht he'd spotted from shore. She was a beautiful boat, probably worth more than most people's houses, with the kind of offshore capability that could handle current conditions. More importantly, she was the only vessel in the harbor large enough to conduct a rescue operation in building seas. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Frank turned to find a yacht club staff member hurrying toward him, the same young man who'd been helping coordinate dock activities earlier in the morning. "Taking this boat to pick up survivors," Frank replied simply, stepping aboard the motor yacht without invitation. "You can't just, this is a private vessel. You need permission from the owner." Frank paused at the boat's helm station and looked back at the staff member. "Where's the owner?" He's not here right now, but..." "Then I'm borrowing his boat." Frank was already examining the engine controls and steering systems. You can explain to him later that it was either this or watch people drown. The yacht's engines were diesels, twin screws with enough power to punch through the chop outside the harbor. Frank found the ignition keys in a small hidden compartment near the helm, a common practice among boat owners who trusted yacht club security. The engines fired immediately, settling into a steady rumble that Frank felt through the deck. "Sir, I'm calling security," the staff member shouted over the engine noise. "Call whoever you want," Frank replied, already casting off the dock lines with practiced efficiency. "But do it from shore." Frank backed the motor yacht away from the dock with smooth confidence, drawing stares and shouts from the yacht club members gathered on the waterfront. He could see Thornfield among them, the Commodore's face red with indignation as he gestured frantically toward the unauthorized departure. But Frank had no time for yacht club politics. Through the helm windows, he could see Sarah's Dream still floating inverted about half a mile offshore, surrounded by the dark heads of crew members in the water. The race committee boat had managed to get close enough to throw life rings, but the small vessel was clearly struggling in the deteriorating conditions. Frank pushed the throttles forward and felt the big motor yacht surge toward open water. She was a well-designed boat, her deep V hull cutting through the chop with authority. Frank settled into the rhythm of heavy weather navigation, reading the wave patterns, timing his course changes to minimize stress on the boat and crew. As he cleared the harbor mouth, Frank got his first real sense of how bad conditions had become. The wind was now gusting over 35 knots, and the wave height had built to 6 feet, with occasional larger sets. Not impossible conditions for a boat this size, but dangerous enough to demand respect and skill. The overturned yacht was taking a beating. Frank could see her hull rolling with each wave, and he knew that crew members still trapped in air pockets under the boat would be running out of time. The race committee boat had managed to pick up 2 survivors, but Frank counted at least 4 people still in the water. Frank brought the motor yacht alongside the committee boat, close enough to shout over the wind and engine noise. "How many people were on board?" "6," the committee boat captain shouted back. "We've got 2. 4 still missing." Frank looked at the overturned hull and made a quick assessment. The boat was floating higher than she should be, suggesting air trapped inside. That could mean survivors were breathing in an air pocket under the hull, or it could mean the boat was taking on water and would sink completely at any moment. "I'm going under to check for survivors," Frank shouted. "You're what?" The committee boat captain looked at him in disbelief. "Sir, you can't. The water temperature is 53 degrees, and we don't know how stable that hull is." Frank was already stripping off his jacket and shoes. At 68, he was hardly the ideal candidate for a cold water rescue dive, but he was also the only person on scene with the training and experience to navigate the maze of rigging and debris under an overturned yacht. "Keep this boat in position," Frank called to no one in particular as he moved to the motor yacht's stern. "If I bring someone up, you'll need to get them aboard fast." Frank paused at the transom, looking down at the dark water. 30 years ago, this would have been routine, a training exercise he could complete without thinking. Now, it was a calculated risk that could easily kill him along with anyone he was trying to save. But through the chop and spray, Frank could see Sarah on the distant shore, her hands pressed to her mouth as she watched the rescue effort. And somewhere in the dark water below, Michael Chen was either fighting for his life or already beyond help. Frank dove. The shock of 53-degree water hit Frank like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and sending his heart rate skyrocketing. For a moment, the cold was so intense that his body simply shut down, suspended in the dark water, while his nervous system tried to process the assault. But Frank had been in cold water before. During training exercises in the North Atlantic, survival courses in Alaska, combat operations in conditions that would have killed an unprepared man. His body remembered the drill: control the breathing, ignore the pain, focus on the mission. He forced his eyes open and oriented himself in the underwater chaos beneath Sarah's Dream. The yacht's mast extended down into the water like a spear, surrounded by a tangle of rigging lines and sails. Her cabin was completely submerged, but Frank could see an air pocket trapped in the forward part of the hull, a silver bubble that might contain survivors. Frank swam toward the bubble, his movements slow and deliberate. The cold was already affecting his coordination, and the tangle of lines and cables around the overturned boat created a maze that could easily trap an unwary diver. He'd seen too many rescue attempts fail because rescuers became victims themselves. As he approached the trapped air pocket, Frank heard something that made his heart race. Voices, faint and distorted by the water, but definitely human voices coming from inside the overturned hull. Frank found an opening near the boat's bow, where the deck met the water's surface inside the air pocket. He surfaced carefully, his head breaking through into a cramped space, lit only by the eerie green glow of water reflecting off the hull. "Hello?" Frank called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Here! We're here!" The response came from somewhere deeper in the hull. Frank recognized Michael's voice, tight with cold and fear, but strong. Frank swam toward the voice, navigating by touch through the inverted cabin. His hands found the edge of what had been the boat's main salon, now a partially flooded cave with perhaps 2 feet of airspace between the water and the upside-down deck. Michael Chen was there, treading water with one arm while supporting an unconscious crew member with the other. Even in the dim light, Frank could see that both men were suffering from hypothermia, their movements sluggish and their breathing labored. "Frank?" Michael's voice was filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" "Getting you out," Frank replied simply. "How many others?" "Just us. Thompson and Garner made it out when we went over, but Jenkins here hit his head on something. He's been unconscious for maybe 5 minutes." Frank quickly assessed the situation. The unconscious crew member, Jenkins, was breathing but unresponsive, probably suffering from a concussion as well as hypothermia. Michael was conscious but clearly struggling, his lips blue with cold, and his movements increasingly uncoordinated. "We need to get out of here now," Frank said. "This air pocket won't last much longer, and you're both hypothermic. Getting 2 men out through the maze of rigging and debris would be nearly impossible, especially with one unconscious." But Frank had a lifetime of experience in calculating odds and making hard decisions under pressure. "Michael, can you swim?" "I think so. Maybe." "Good enough. I'm going to take Jenkins out first, then come back for you. Can you hold this position for another few minutes?" Michael nodded, though Frank could see the effort it cost him to stay afloat. Frank positioned the unconscious crew member for transport, wrapping one arm around the man's chest while keeping his head above water. "Michael, when I come back, be ready to move fast. This hull could shift or sink at any time." Getting Jenkins out of the overturned hull required every ounce of Frank's remaining strength and 30 years of underwater navigation experience. The unconscious man was dead weight, and the tangle of rigging lines seemed to grab at them with every movement. Frank forced himself to move slowly and methodically, checking each pathway before committing to it. In the dark water beneath the hull, it would be easy to become disoriented and trapped. But Frank's Navy training had included extensive work in confined spaces and zero-visibility environments. He navigated by feel and instinct, following the curve of the hull toward open water. When they finally broke the surface outside the overturned yacht, Frank's lungs were burning and his muscles were cramping from the cold. But Jenkins was still breathing, and Frank could see the race committee boat maneuvering to pick them up. "Got one," Frank shouted, his voice hoarse from the cold water. "Unconscious, possible head injury." The committee boat crew hauled Jenkins aboard with practiced efficiency, immediately wrapping him in emergency blankets and checking his vital signs. Frank treaded water beside the boat, forcing his exhausted muscles to keep him afloat while he prepared for the second rescue. "Sir, you need to get out of the water," the committee boat captain called down to him. "You've been in too long already." Frank shook his head, water streaming from his gray hair. "One more still inside, Michael Chen." "Sir, you're hypothermic. We can't risk losing you too." Frank looked back at the overturned yacht, her hull riding lower in the water than it had been 10 minutes earlier. The air pocket that was keeping Michael alive was shrinking, and Frank could see that the boat's position was becoming less stable. "No time to argue," Frank said, and dove again. The second dive was harder than the first. Frank's body was fighting the cold with increasingly desperate measures, shunting blood away from his extremities and making his movements clumsy and slow. But Michael Chen was family, not just by marriage, but by the bonds forged through years of shared holidays, quiet conversations, and mutual respect. Frank found Michael where he'd left him, still conscious but barely able to keep his head above water. The air pocket had shrunk considerably, and the water level inside the hull was rising. "Frank?" Michael's voice was weak, his movements uncoordinated. "Right here. We're going out together." Frank positioned himself beside Michael, wrapping one arm around the younger man's chest. "Michael, I need you to help me swim. Can you kick your legs?" Michael nodded, though Frank could feel how much effort even that simple response required. The swim out was a nightmare of cold water, tangled lines, and failing strength. Frank's vision was starting to tunnel from hypothermia, and his navigation skills were reduced to basic instinct. But he kept moving, pulling Michael along, following the curve of the hull toward daylight. They broke the surface together just as Frank felt his strength give out completely. The race committee boat was there immediately, hands reaching down to pull them from the water. Frank felt himself being hauled aboard, his body no longer responding to his will as the crew wrapped him in blankets and began checking his vital signs. "Michael," Frank managed to say through chattering teeth. "He's okay," someone assured him. "Hypothermic but conscious. You got him out in time." Frank closed his eyes and let himself drift, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion and cold. He'd done what he came to do. Michael was safe. Jenkins would recover, and the immediate crisis was over. Frank drifted in and out of consciousness as the race committee boat made its way back to the yacht club docks. He was vaguely aware of being transferred to a larger Coast Guard vessel, of warm blankets and hot drinks, of voices discussing his condition in professional medical terms. When he finally came fully awake, Frank found himself lying on a stretcher in what appeared to be the yacht club's first aid station. Sarah was beside him, her face streaked with tears, but her expression relieved. "Dad, how do you feel?" Frank took inventory of his condition, cold, exhausted, and feeling every one of his 68 years, but alive and essentially intact. "Like I've been swimming in the Arctic. The paramedics say you'll be fine. Mild hypothermia, some cuts and bruises, but nothing serious." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Michael's okay too. They're treating him at the hospital, but he's conscious and talking." Frank nodded, then became aware of a commotion outside the first aid station. Through the window, he could see a crowd gathering on the yacht club terrace, and the sound of raised voices carried clearly through the walls. "What's all that about?" Sarah's expression hardened. "Commodore Thornfield is having what you might call a public relations crisis. Turns out that when word got out about what happened, people started asking questions about why a 68-year-old man had to steal a boat to conduct a rescue while the yacht club stood around discussing liability issues." The door to the first aid station opened, and Thornfield himself appeared, flanked by several other yacht club officials. The Commodore's earlier confidence had been replaced by obvious discomfort, and Frank noted that his perfectly groomed appearance had become somewhat disheveled. "Mr. Morrison," Thornfield began, his voice carefully modulated. "First, let me say how grateful we all are for your heroic actions today. Your courage and skill undoubtedly saved lives." Frank studied the Commodore's face, noting the calculation behind the words. "Just did what needed doing." Of course. And I want you to know that the club is prepared to address any concerns about our earlier misunderstanding regarding dress codes and guest policies." "What kind of addressing?" Sarah asked sharply. Thornfield shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we're prepared to offer Mr. Morrison an honorary membership with full privileges. And perhaps we should review our guest policies to ensure they better reflect the club's commitment to honoring military service." Frank sat up slowly, the blankets falling away from his shoulders. "Mr. Thornfield, I appreciate the offer, but I don't think your club and I are a good fit." "But surely, you judged me by my clothes and decided I wasn't good enough for your organization. That's your right, but it tells me everything I need to know about your values." Frank's voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. "The offer of membership now isn't about recognizing my worth. It's about managing your public relations problem." Thornfield's face flushed. "Mr. Morrison, I hope you'll reconsider. The club has a long tradition of supporting veterans and The club has a tradition of supporting veterans who look and dress the part you're comfortable with." Frank interrupted. "What about the veteran who can't afford a yacht club membership? Or the one whose injuries make it hard to stand up straight? Do they meet your standards?" The room fell silent. Through the window, Frank could see that the crowd on the terrace had grown larger, and he suspected that at least some of the conversation was being overheard. Frank stood up, his legs still unsteady, but his resolve firm. "I don't want your membership, Mr. Thornfield. I want you to remember that the next time some old guy in khakis shows up at your club, he might be someone worth knowing." The story of Frank Morrison's rescue spread rapidly through the sailing community and beyond. By evening, video footage from spectators' phones was circulating on social media, showing Frank diving repeatedly beneath the overturned yacht while yacht club officials stood helplessly on shore. The contrast between Frank's decisive action and the club's paralysis became a focal point for discussions about class, privilege, and the true meaning of honor. Thornfield's attempt to offer Frank membership after initially ejecting him from the club was seen by many as a textbook example of damage control rather than genuine recognition. Michael Chen recovered fully from his hypothermia and made a point of publicly crediting Frank with saving his life. Jenkins, the crew member who had been unconscious, suffered a concussion but no permanent damage. Both men spoke to reporters about Frank's skill and courage during the rescue. Frank Morrison is exactly the kind of person every yacht club should be honored to have as a member, Michael told a local television reporter. But he's also the kind of person who doesn't need anyone's validation to know his own worth. The yacht club's response to the incident became a case study in crisis management and institutional values. Thornfield resigned as commodore within a week, citing philosophical differences with the board regarding club direction. The club subsequently announced a comprehensive review of its membership and guest policies, though Frank privately doubted whether real change would follow. For Frank, the incident was both an ending and a beginning. He had proven to himself that his skills and instincts remained sharp despite his age, but he had also been reminded of the civilian world's tendency to judge by appearances rather than substance. 2 weeks later, Frank sat on the deck of Michael and Sarah's house, watching the sunset paint Monterey Bay in shades of gold and crimson. Michael was recovered enough to be back at work, though he had decided to take a break from yacht racing for the remainder of the season. "Any regrets about turning down the yacht club membership?" Sarah asked, settling into the chair beside her father. Frank considered the question seriously. "Number it would have been membership offered for the wrong reasons, and I'm too old to pretend that doesn't matter." The Commodore who replaced Thornfield called again yesterday. He wants to discuss the club's new veteran outreach program. "That's good," Frank said. "Maybe they'll actually mean it this time." They sat in comfortable silence, watching a small sailing dinghy make its way across the bay in the evening breeze. The sailor was clearly inexperienced, the boat moving in fits and starts as he struggled with the basics of wind and sail. "You know what I keep thinking about," Frank said eventually. "What's that?" "All those people on that terrace watching Michael's boat go over. They had resources, connections, expensive boats. But when it mattered, when lives were on the line, they all stood around waiting for someone else to take responsibility." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "While you stole a boat and dove into 50-degree water. Sometimes the right thing to do is obvious," Frank said simply. "The hard part is being willing to do it." As the sun disappeared behind the coastal hills, Frank reflected on the lessons of the yacht club incident. He had been reminded that respect must be earned rather than assumed, that character reveals itself under pressure, and that true authority comes from action rather than position. The young sailor in the dinghy had finally found his rhythm, the small boat moving smoothly across the darkening water. Frank watched with satisfaction, remembering his own early struggles with wind and sail, the patient instruction of experienced sailors, and the gradual development of skills that would serve him for a lifetime. "You taught me something important that day," Sarah said quietly. "What's that?" "That it's better to be excluded from the wrong group than included in it for the wrong reasons." Frank smiled, thinking of the lessons he'd learned from his own father, a man who had valued integrity over comfort and principle over popularity. Those lessons had served Frank well in 30 years of military service, and they continued to guide him in civilian life. The yacht club would continue its existence, probably with slightly modified policies and a new emphasis on veteran outreach. The wealthy members would continue their sailing competitions and social gatherings, perhaps with a bit more awareness of their assumptions about worth and belonging. But Frank Morrison would continue to be exactly who he had always been, a man who judged others by their actions rather than their appearances, who took responsibility when others hesitated, and who understood that true honor couldn't be purchased or bestowed by committee. As the first stars appeared over Monterey Bay, Frank Morrison smiled and began planning his next visit to see his family. There would be no yacht club functions on the agenda, but there would be grandchildren to teach about sailing, stories to share about service and sacrifice, and quiet moments to pass on the values that mattered most. The rescue at the yacht club had ended exactly as it should have, not with membership in an exclusive organization, but with the knowledge that when courage was required, it had been provided by someone who understood the true meaning of service.